Shalom, beloved, and hopefully everyone is doing wonderful today. The devil is in the detail, part two. Why you, right? Why you? Why you went through all this that you've been going through? Now, before I get into this, let me say this. For those that have the patience, the stomach, the spirit, the mindset, the courage, right? To sit back and listen and hear something that you may have or may not have heard before or even thought of. And for those that are deep rooted in religion or think that the so-called white man wrote the Bible and then gave it to us, this is not for you. This is not for you at all. Now, let me say this as well before I get into this. When someone goes to war with their enemy, they'll study them. They'll study their culture, they'll study their history, they'll study the customs, they know their laws. Now put that in your spirit. So I always tell you, think about the Bible from a historical perspective, from a cultural perspective, and also understanding that it is a law book. That the Bible is a law book. Now, let's get into this. Now, this doesn't take away all the credible sources and information to establish the fact that there were already so-called black people or melanated people over here in this country already. This doesn't take away from that. In fact, when you study the Bible, you begin to realize that it really supports it when you really begin to study, right? But anyway, it's a whole nother subject in a whole nother video. But anyway, when the colonizer began to come over here and occupy this land and try to establish their form of government, the wealthy, right, allowed and helped in many cases foreigners to come over here, right, and employ them by way of indentured servants. Now, again, remember that the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, the Scottish, and other races as well, right, also so-called black people, came over here at one time, and some of them fell into what we call indentured servants. We hear this all the time, that all these people were indentured servants at one time. We hear this. Like I keep trying to tell you, the devil is in the detail. Now, there's a difference between chattel slavery and indentured servants. We all know that as well. What most people don't realize is that both of these practices have biblical roots. But also that both of these practices, the people that fell into these practices, they had rights. They had rules that would protect them, right? They had laws that would protect them from, right, the slave master or the one that they was serving. They had rules to protect them. So you have to, again, you have to put that in your spirit. Like I said, so as these indentured servants were coming over here and they were being paid, right, being paid for their labor, then once this country began to move in the direction of chattel slavery, right, to have this free labor to help build its wealth, this is the question you should ask yourself. Why didn't they use that same mindset by putting all these groups that came over here, right, that didn't have the money to have the resources? Why didn't they use this practice on all the groups, all the races? But they chose you out of all these other people. Once you begin to realize that the reason why they chose you is because your customs, your culture, right, your laws, you would be more familiar with this. It would not be part of the Irish and the Italians and the Germans and the, and the Scottish and whoever else. It wouldn't be part of their practice. It wouldn't be part of their culture. Remember, you would study your enemies, you study their culture, you study their practice, you'll know their history. And you can use that against them. That's why it begin to make more sense also when you begin to see all these uprisings from, our forefathers that were enslaved. Because they understood that the so-called slave master was going above and beyond. He was breaking the rules, which again goes to the other point, the slave Bible. This is why they took out certain verses, right? Certain passages in the Bible. Because they thought they can use this as an advantage, but still implement this form of slavery or bondage on one particular group and no one else. Because again, they will be familiar with it because of their culture, their customs, right? Their history. Again, which brings me up to another point. Once they begin to remove chattel slavery and, emancipate so-called Negro, right? The enslaved. Once they begin to set them free, then they came up with this form of punishment by hanging them from a tree. Again, why them? Why no other group but primarily the so-called Negro? See, when you begin to look at this from a historical perspective and cultural perspective, and understand that, again, this book is a law book, you begin to see the devil is in the detail. Like I said, when you go to war with a people, you will study their custom, their culture, their history. You will be familiar with things about them. Anyway, that's what I see. That being said, as usual, peace, love, shalom.